Today I've decided to give my neighbours a rest from the grinding and the welding that went on for several hours yesterday. So I've decided to do a little bit of experimentation on the actual design of the sword itself and the weight and the balance of the sword. At the moment, the sword balances somewhere around there, sort of 2 hand widths from the crossguard, slightly towards the middle of the sword. And essentially I needed to work out how much material I'm going to be adding to the pommel and the upper guard area, so how much that weight's then going to shift towards this back end of the sword. At the moment, the sword moves fairly accurately for a Viking sword. Viking swords were meant to be used in conjunction with a hand shield. So they were designed to be able to turn around a point somewhere in the first third of the blade, so that if an unnoticed attack came in and you needed to use your blade to ward off that attack, you could move very quickly in a side-to-side motion to defend yourself. So the point of rotation on the sword blade itself works fairly nicely for the type of sword that it is. But I've basically drawn out around the pommel on this piece of 8mm stock. It's the same stock material that I've made the crossguard out of. I don't know if you can see this roughly, but that's approximately the pommel dimensions that I've kind of planned, leaving myself a little bit of space to weld in and around it. And so this piece itself actually represents roughly the amount of material minus these little kind of sections where I'll be cutting off that little bit of excess, but this roughly represents the amount of weight that I'll be adding to the pommel end of the sword. If I take the sword and place this on the pommel section, you can see now that that moves the balance point about a hand's width closer to the crossguard. And the other concern that I've had is that for a Viking style sword, the hand grips on a Viking style sword, because they were strictly single-handed, fitted very tightly against the user's hand. Whereas on this, there's currently a good 3/4 of an inch or thereabouts distance, which would allow the sword to slip around when in use, theoretically, even though I've got a raping and pillaging on the menu. So I was considering chopping this and moving the whole pommel upper guard section towards the crossguard. And I was concerned about how much that might actually change the balance point of the sword when I've removed that material and moved the weight closer to the fulcrum. So I drew a couple of marks to mark out hypothetically how far I intended to move it from the position where the bottom of the upper guard will be, and then ½ inch further along the actual sword itself. And ultimately, what I've discovered, quite surprisingly to myself, is that if the balance point is about a hand's width from the crossguard now, if I move this ½ inch further forwards so that it fits very nicely against my hand itself, balance point only shifts 5mm or so towards the point end of the blade for that maybe twice that distance movement of this amount of weight on the pommel itself. So whereas I was worried initially that if I shortened the handle it could significantly change the way that the sword moves, this has kind of put that to bed for me.